It's always good to come back to my hometown, Montreal. I remember well my university days in the late 60s, times of student activism, not only here at McGill, but at Sir George Williams University. The issues at the time, I remember them well. In the Vietnam War, we were talking about racial equality or racial inequality. Today, that same passion, that same zeal seems to be engendered by events in the Middle East. And it's a challenge to examine and to report on Middle East with dispassion. Because long-standing, deep-seated persuasions, animosities exist on both sides that have polarized nations and peoples around the world. Over the past 60 years, the Arab-Israeli conflict has dominated the Middle East affairs. The ultimate and the inevitable victims of these years of strife are the people in the region, who were uprooted from their homes and displaced. Now, two populations of refugees emerged from the conflict, both Palestinians from mandated Palestine and Jews from Arab countries, both groups recognized as bona fide refugees by the relevant United Nations agencies. And yet, when the issue of Middle East refugees is raised, people invariably refer only to Palestinian refugees. So to provide some perspective, I will begin by delineating the international standards that are applicable to all refugees worldwide. Then I will present the case and cause for Palestinian refugees, because to know one must need to know the other. And then I will focus exclusively on Jewish refugees, what I call the victims of double discrimination. Now I must underscore at the outset that asserting rights and redress for Jewish refugees from Arab countries is intended neither to argue against any claimed Palestinian refugee rights, nor to negate any suffering. It is a legitimate call to recognize that Jewish refugees, as a matter of law and equity, possess the same rights as do all other refugees. Now to begin, the United Nations, through statute and precedent, has developed international standards and mechanisms for the protection, resettlement, and rehabilitation of refugees around the world. The first standard, who is a refugee? According to the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, the convention adopted in 1951, a refugee is a person who, owing to a well-founded fear of being persecuted for reasons of race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group, or political opinion. 1. 2 is outside the country of his nationality. And 3 is unable to, or owing to such fear, is unwilling to avail themselves of the protection of that country. 3 key factors in this definition. 1, well-founded fear of being persecuted. 2, outside the country of nationality. And 3, unable or unwilling to avail themselves of the protection of that country. Let's hold that for later. The second standard is the nature of 3 fundamental services that the international community must provide under international humanitarian law. That is, number 1, protection. If refugees are in danger, the international community must provide for their safe haven. 2, resettlement. Once they are safe, protected, the objective is to resettle them. And look at this, it's seeking permanent solutions for the voluntary repatriation or their assimilation in any other national communities. Resettlement is an objective of refugee care for the international community. And 3, rehabilitation. Once they're safe, once they're resettled, you can rehabilitate their assets and secure whatever it is they happen to have left behind. These are the international standards that are applicable to all the world's refugees, except, as we shall see later, to Palestinian refugees. Now, how many refugees are there? Globally, as of January 2015, there were 42,873,743 people who have suffered what's called forced displacement. This number is the highest level since the early 1990s due to the escalation of conflicts, particularly now in Syria, in Iraq, and other hotspots. Of those 42 million, that same year, in 2014, only 1.8 million displaced persons were returned home. 4%. A dismal record for international protection and resettlement of refugees. Indeed, in these figures are Palestinian refugees, although in all respects they are unique from all other of the world's refugees. And by way of example, Emanating as a result of the 1948 conflict in the Middle East, Palestinians are the world's longest standing refugee population. 2, they have their own separate refugee relief agency, UNRWA. 3, they and their descendants inherit their status as refugees. And 4, they even have their own definition of a refugee. The United Nations Relief and Works Agency, or UNRWA, utilizes the following definition applicable to Palestinian refugees only and their descendants. A Palestinian refugee is a person whose normal residence was Palestine for a minimum of 2 years preceding the conflict in 1948, and who, as a result of this conflict, lost both his home and his means of livelihood and took refuge in one of the countries where UNRWA provides relief. You will note that this definition differs substantially from the UNHCR definition applicable to the world's refugees in 3 significant areas. Number 1, no mention of a fear of persecution. 2, no mention of being outside the country of nationality, only a residency requirement of 2 years in what was mandated Palestine. And number 3, no mention of protection, no mention of resettlement. The objective, or the definition of Palestinian refugees, by definition, provides them to remain refugees, to not be resettled, to not be rehabilitated. Question: how many Palestinian refugees, in fact, are there or were there? The numbers vary according to who you ask. These figures were gleaned from a 1949 original document produced by the United Nations Conciliation Commission for Palestine. It lists estimates of the number of Palestinian refugees provided by the British, by the United States, by Palestinians, by Israel, and by the United Nations. They range from the highest US estimate of 875,000 Palestinian refugees to the lowest estimate, that of Israel, of 520,000 refugees. However, the most credible figure is the one in the middle, which was produced by the UN Conciliation Commission, which estimated that there were 726,000 Palestinian refugees displaced as a result of the 1948 Israel's War of Independence. 726,000 Palestinian refugees at the outset. Today, the number of Palestinian refugees is much different. Today, as a result of the definition that descendants of the original 726,000 Palestinian refugees inherit their parents' or grandparents' refugee status as well, UNRWA reports that as of January 2014, there were 5,493,115 Palestinian refugees. Now, it must be noted that not all of these 5.4 million registered Palestinian refugees currently live in the region. These figures delineate where the refugees emanated from, but are not necessarily living today. Many are living in the United States, many are living in Canada, many are living in Europe, and yet many have attained citizenship of other countries. 2 million Palestinians resident in Jordan have Jordanian citizenship. Over 500,000 Palestinian refugees live in the United States, with full US citizenship. But once again, unlike the definition for all the world's refugees, i.e., when you achieve citizenship of another country, you are no longer a refugee, Palestinian refugees retain their refugee status even though they obtain citizenship from another country. Notwithstanding, all these Palestinian refugees, 5.4 million of them, retain rights as refugees, which are enshrined in numerous UN resolutions, declarations, covenants, and conventions, some of which are listed here. More importantly, there remain millions of Palestinian refugees in dire and life-threatening circumstances, particularly in Syria and Lebanon. And we must recognize that it is a travesty that the international community has allowed this problem to fester for over half a century, continuing and perpetuating the suffering and misery of so many people. However, the continuing suffering of many Palestinian refugees does not negate the fact that there were also Jews displaced from some 10 Arab countries, beginning roughly at the same time period, also victims of the Arab world's struggle against the founding of the State of Israel. Now, we must recognize, Jews have never been interlopers in the region. In fact, Jews are the indigenous people of the region. For over 2,500 years, Jews have resided in North Africa, the Middle East, and the Gulf region in substantial numbers, fully 1,000 years before the advent of Islam. Following the Muslim conquest of the region under Islamic rule, Jews and Christians were considered dhimmi, a privileged minority, but still second-class citizens. Jews were, for a period of time, permitted limited religious, educational, professional, and business opportunities. However, this situation changed dramatically in the 20th century, which led to, in the contemporary vernacular, the ethnic cleansing of virtually all Jews from Arab countries throughout the region. The uprooting of 856,000 Jews from their ancient Jewish communities did not occur by happenstance. State-sanctioned repressive measures, coupled with violence and repression, precipitated the mass exodus of Jews from their places of birth throughout the Middle East. Now, it is true that not all Arab countries treated Jews the same way. There are some countries, by their conduct, Tunisia, Morocco, who were as benevolent as any other country was towards their Jews. There are other countries who exacted extreme draconian measures against their Jews, but the result was still the same. From 856,000 Jews, less than 4,000 Jews remain today in some 10 Arab countries. You'll notice also that it coincides with every Arab-Israeli conflict. 1948, 1956, 1967, 1972. Every time there was a conflict in the Middle East between the Arabs and Israel, the Jews in Arab countries suffer accordingly. There is ample evidence also that points to a collusion, a shared pattern of conduct amongst the Arab regimes that appeared intended to coerce Jews to leave, or at least use them as weapons in the Arab world's struggle against the founding of the State of Israel. Here we see a document which I discovered in the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees archives in Geneva. It reports on in 1947, the political committee of the Arab League met in Beirut and drafted this law, a law that was to govern the legal status of Jewish residents in all Arab League countries. Arab states colluded to discriminate against Jews in all of its member states. At the time, Egypt, Iraq, Lebanon, Saudi Arabia, Syria, Jordan, and Yemen. This draft law of the Arab League provided that, and I quote, all Jews were to be considered members of the Jewish minority of Palestine. Jews believed to be Zionists would be interned as political prisoners and their assets confiscated. The draft law imposes denationalization, and there were denationalizations. The draft law requires freezing of Jewish bank accounts, and Jewish bank accounts were indeed frozen by decree. The draft law diverts funds of frozen Jewish bank accounts to pay for the Arab wars against Israel. And that is exactly what happened, by country, by law. The draft law requires internment and confiscation of property of, quote, active Zionists. And Zionism became a crime, a capital offense throughout the region, and in some cases, punishable by death. This draft law became a blueprint in country after country for 5 distinct types of measures emanating and eventually enacted against its Jewish populations. Number 1, violence and pogroms. Number 2, denationalization. Number 3, legal discriminatory decrees. Number 4, economic despoilment. And number 5, expulsions. Now, it's fashionable to say that Zionism was responsible for the mistreatment of Jews in Arab countries. However, anti-Semitism, discrimination, pogroms, and related events, such as riots, arrests, murders of public figures, destruction of synagogues, was prevalent in the region well before 1947. So while not intended to be an exhaustive listing, the following are some specific examples of which we speak. In Algeria, speaking about violence that was precipitated against Jews throughout the region. In Algeria, in August 5th, 1934, a pogrom took place in Constantine. 27 people were killed. In 1957 in Algeria, there were murders in Oran and Medea. The main synagogue in Algiers was ransacked in December of 1960. Massacres were perpetrated on July 5th, 1962, the very day of Algerian independence. In Egypt, anti-Semitic riots broke out in several towns in November of 1945. Massive arrests occurred in May of 1948 when 1,000 Jews were detained and accused of being Zionists. On November 2nd, 1948, riots and lootings took place in Cairo. On January 26, 1952, Black Saturday saw riots and acts of violence. In Iraq, June 1st and 2nd, 1941, a day infamous in Jewish history, the Farhud took place in Baghdad. 180 people were killed and 600 people were injured. In 1948, a wave of official anti-Jewish persecutions, including arrests and economic sanctions, took place. Jews were executed in September of 1948 in Baghdad. During 1949, Zionist movement members were arrested and tortured. In June 1950, by decree, Jews were obliged to give up all of their possessions and houses. The main synagogue was attacked in Baghdad in 1950. 3 people were killed and 20 injured. In Lebanon, Jews were kidnapped and murdered during 1967. Following a series of kidnappings and murders of Jews in 1971, 4 Jewish community leaders were accused of Zionism and executed. In Libya, riots in the Jewish quarters occurred in Tripoli in January 1945. 60% of Jewish homes and businesses were destroyed that day, and 135 people were murdered. In 1948, there were more riots. In 1963, Jewish community leaders were attacked and injured. In 1967, riots broke out and 10 people were killed. Jewish cemeteries were destroyed in 1970. 64 synagogues were destroyed in 1978 in Libya, and 78 synagogues were converted into mosques. Even in Morocco, the place where Jews enjoyed the most of relative freedoms and liberty, the Jewish quarter of Fez was ransacked as early as 1912. In May of 1938, in 2 separate pogroms, 43 Jews were killed in Morocco. In June of 1948, anti-Jewish riots took place in Rija and Jarada. In August of 1954, 6 Jews were killed. The kidnapping and forced conversion of a dozen young Jewish girls occurred in 1961-62 in Morocco. In Syria, in November of 1947, pogroms took place in several towns. Synagogues were torched and several hundred Jews were arrested. The Al-Menashe synagogue in Damascus was attacked. On August 5, 1949, 13 people were killed and 32 people were injured. In Tunisia, in January of 1952, riots occurred in Tunis with 1 person killed. In 1956, riots occurred and the Great Tunis Synagogue was destroyed in 1960. The Jewish quarter was plundered on June 6, 1967, and the Great Synagogue was once again ransacked. Jews were murdered in Jerba in 1982, and the Jerba Synagogue was attacked in as late as April of 2002. Lastly, in Yemen, a series of riots and looting took place in 1931 and 1947. 80 people were killed. The blood libel was leveled against the Jews of Sa'ana in 1948. These were not random acts. There are those in the Arab world who contend that they were indeed random acts of violence, that there was anger in the streets that could not be contained. This is a specious argument that belies the active incitement of the governing powers of the day, witnessed by such decrees stripping Jews of citizenship, which was the first attack against the Jews on a legislative and legal basis. In Egypt, the first nationality code, enacted on May 26, 1926, stated that a person born in Egypt was entitled to Egyptian nationality only if their father, quote, belonged racially to the majority of the population of a country whose language is Arabic and whose religion is Islam. This provision later served in the mid-1950s as the official pretext for expelling many Jews from Egypt. In Iraq, in 1950, a law was utilized to deprive Jews of their Iraqi nationality. In Libya, the nationality laws enacted in June of 1951 decreed that the personal status of non-Muslims would be governed by Islamic religious courts. Jews were no longer allowed to vote or to hold public office. On August 8, 1962, the Council of Ministers in Libya announced a royal decree which provided that a Libyan national forfeited his nationality if he had come into any contact with Zionism, defined as someone who has acted, quote, morally or materially in favor of Israel interests. The vague language allowed authorities to deprive Jews of Libyan nationality at will. Then there were the discriminatory decrees. In Egypt, Iraq, Lebanon, Libya, Morocco, Syria, Tunisia, Yemen, the pattern remained the same. Jews were excluded from public service. Jewish schools were placed under surveillance. Jews were forbidden to live in many areas in the countries. Jewish history and Hebrew language instruction was prohibited. Jewish students were expelled from universities. Jewish Zionist organizations, Maccabi Sports Club, were forbidden. Jews were prohibited from acquiring new possessions. They were no longer allowed to vote, hold public office, or serve in the army or the police. Real estate purchase was prohibited to Jews. Even decrees like in Yemen specified forced conversions of orphans, Jewish orphans, to Islam. Jewish economic interests were also targeted. The liquid assets, bank accounts, and property were submitted to sequestration and nationalization, held for ransom, and stolen when they departed. By way of example, in Egypt in 1948, a law concerning companies decreed that 75% of employees had to be real Egyptians, defined as Arabs or Muslims. There were bans against employing Jews in certain sectors, petroleum and agriculture. Nationality certificates were required for every commercial transaction, but Jews could not obtain them. Jews leaving the country were forced to transfer their possessions to the state and to pay considerable departure expenses. In 1960 and 1975, a Canadian Jewish sponsor, the Ronald Feld Foundation, paid ransoms to get people out of Syria. We were buying Jewish lives. The last prohibition, either expulsion or forbidding them to leave. Administrative harassment, the refusal to deliver passports, holding families hostage, creating a difficult atmosphere. Jews became de facto prisoners. In Egypt in 1948, martial law banned Jews from leaving Egypt. In the 1950s, passports were taken away from people leaving the country. Edicts of expulsion in Egypt began in 1958. In Libya, by a new nationality law, Libyan Jews were not allowed to have passports or Libyan nationality certificates. In Morocco, in 1956, there were difficulties for Jews who were trying to obtain passports. Their families were held hostage in order for them to come back. In 1973, Syria cut off all of its Jewish community and forbade them to have any contact with people abroad. In Tunisia, Jews were required to sever all contacts with Israel in 1956. And Yemen, in 1949, prohibited their Jewish community from leaving. I want to reiterate that the list of official decrees that I've just described is not an exhaustive summary. There are hundreds and hundreds of such discriminatory edicts and such measures enacted in all Arab countries. All of these human rights violations not only caused extreme legal and financial hardship, but also precipitated a severe climate of fear and intimidation. Jews were in mortal danger, and most realized that they no longer had any future in the country in which they were born. The danger was well known. Here we see an article which appeared in the New York Times on May 16, 1948, just 2 days after the State of Israel was proclaimed. Jews throughout the region, North Africa, the Middle East, and the Gulf, began to flee for their lives. They fled to any safe haven that would accept them. Where did they go? Some 2/3, or nearly 650,000 Jews, immigrated to Israel to fulfill the Zionist dream of returning to the ancient homeland of the Jewish people. Roughly 1/3, or over 200,000 Jews, went to countries other than Israel, including France, the United Kingdom, the United States, Canada, and faraway places like South America and Australia. In virtually all cases, as Jews were forced to flee, individual and communal properties were seized and were confiscated without any compensation whatsoever provided by the Arab governments involved. When our organization, Justice for Jews from Arab Countries, began to bring to attention the plight of Jewish refugees, we brought this matter to the officials at the State Department. That was an interesting meeting some 14 years ago. They challenged us with 2 fundamental questions. Number 1, what makes you think that Jews fleeing Arab countries were refugees? They were not refugees. They went to Israel, they had a place to go, they went somewhere else. They were not refugees. And number 2, even if they were refugees, what makes you think they have any rights today, 65 years after the fact, when all are resettled in Israel or elsewhere and living quite well, thank you? 2 legitimate questions deserving of answers. We conducted extensive legal research, and we determined, to the first question, were Jews displaced from Arab countries really refugees? The answer is yes. on 2 separate occasions, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees determined that Jews fleeing Arab countries were indeed bona fide refugees according to international law under the mandate of the High Commissioner for Refugees. The first time in 1957 with respect to Jews fleeing from Egypt, and the second time in 1967 where it refers to Jews from Middle Eastern and North African countries, all the Maghreb, not Jews from one specific country, but all Jews fleeing from that region were indeed refugees, so recognized by the UNHCR under international law. But they were refugees. Number 2, to the second question. Do they have any rights today, over half a century later? Once again, the answer is yes. There is no statute of limitations on the rights of refugees. The passage of time does not negate refugee rights to petition for redress for the mass violations of human rights as well as their personal losses. If a refugee left behind assets, bank accounts, pension plans, they do not lose those rights to those assets, notwithstanding how many years have passed. And we have determined that under international law, the rights of Jewish refugees from our countries are compelling, and their recognition finds expression in numerous legal and political declarations. UN Resolution 242 is seminal. I'll deal with that specifically in a moment. However, the Madrid Peace Conference of 1991, established a multilateral working group on refugees. Canada was nominated chairman of that multilateral working group of refugees. The mandate for this working group for refugees, quote, to consider practical ways of improving the lot of people throughout the region who have been displaced from their homes. Generic language, applicable to all refugees, not only Palestinians. The roadmap of 2002, currently still being advanced by the Quartet as a roadmap for peace in the Middle East, also refers to, quote, an agreed, just, fair, and realistic solution to the refugee issue. In all previous bilateral Israeli agreements, the Israeli-Egypt treaty talks about implement the refugee problem. The Israel-Jordanian peace treaty talks about the massive human rights problem caused to both parties by the conflict in the Middle East. Nowhere is there explicit exclusivity for Palestinian refugees. All international entities documents are generic in form, allowing for the inclusion of both Palestinians and Arabs. The most definitive international resolution that pertains directly to Jewish refugees is UN Resolution 242. It spells out the parameters of a recommended peace. As ultimately adopted, Resolution 242 stipulates that a comprehensive peace settlement should necessarily include, quote, a just settlement of the refugee problem. Once again, no distinction is made between Arab refugees and Jewish refugees. Now, how do we know that 242 refers to Jewish refugees? Before it was adopted by the United Nations Security Council, 3 weeks before, the 4th Committee of the UN met in Lake Success, New York. The Brits put this resolution on, a draft resolution, on the table for discussion. The Soviet delegation at the time introduced an amendment which would have had this, say, called a just settlement of the Arab refugee problem. This amendment was debated for 3 days. It was voted upon, and it was rejected by the community of nations, signifying that the UN 4th Committee did not want this resolution to apply uniquely and only to Palestinian refugees. Moreover, that was the intent of the original co-sponsors. Judge Arthur Goldberg, who was one of the co-sponsors with Lord Carrington of UN Resolution 242, states in his memoirs, and I quote, the language of Resolution 242 refers both to Arab and Jewish refugees, for about an equal number of each abandoned their homes as a result of several wars. Resolution 242 is the strongest UN consideration of the legitimate rights for Jewish refugees, although it never refers to them specifically. In addition to the legal basis for Jewish refugees from our countries, there has also been political recognition of the plight and their national rights. Former US President Jimmy Carter, in 1977, after Camp David I, said, Palestinians have rights. Obviously, there are Jewish refugees. They have the same rights as others do. Former President Clinton, in 2000, after Camp David II, said, there will be some sort of international fund set up for refugees, a fund which compensates the Israelis who were made refugees by the war, which occurred after the birth of the State of Israel. Canada has played an important role in similarly recognizing the rights of Jewish refugees from Arab countries. Canadian Prime Minister Paul Martin, in 2005, stated, "A refugee is a refugee, and that the situation of Jewish refugees from Arab lands must be recognized." One of only 2 Western leaders who have ever recognized the rights of Jewish refugees. And in 2014, the Canadian Parliament addressed this issue. And at that time, Canadian Foreign Minister John Baird stated, and I quote, "Fair and acknowledgement of all refugee populations arising out of the Arab-Israeli conflict requires the recognition of Jewish refugees." So this linkage and requisite to deal simultaneously with both refugee populations has been enshrined in parliamentary initiatives in the United States, Israel, and Canada. In the United States, in 2008, the US Congress adopted H.R. 185, unanimously proclaiming that in all Middle East negotiations, any explicit reference to Palestinian refugees must be matched by a similar reference to Jewish refugees. In Canada, in March of 2014, and I quote, "The Government of Canada, through a concurrence motion in Parliament, officially recognizes the experience of Jewish refugees who were displaced from states in the Middle East and North Africa after 1948. These governments have concluded that it would be inappropriate for the international community to recognize rights for one refugee population, Palestinians, without recognizing equal rights for other victims of that very same conflict, Jews from Arab countries. Such recognition of 2 Middle East refugee populations has not yet been widely accepted, notwithstanding the fact that, as you see, there were more Jewish refugees than Palestinian refugees. There are few international arenas that provide a balanced platform for the discussion of these seminal issues, and this particularly applies to the United Nations, the arena for the second case of discrimination against Jews displaced from Arab countries. There is a glaring anomaly in the way the United Nations responded to these 2 Middle East populations, a damning indictment of the UN and its affiliated agencies. Our research reveals startling differential and disproportional treatment by the UN in favor of Arab refugees as opposed to Jewish refugees. We examined UN resolutions, all UN resolutions since 1948, every agency that was mandated or ever dealt with Palestinian or Arab Jewish refugees, and the financial resources allocated to both of these refugee populations. Let's start with the United Nations Security Council, the most powerful UN entity. Since its inception, the Security Council has been seminally involved in Middle East affairs. From 1946 to 2014, the total number of Security Council resolutions on the Middle East is 311. 9 resolutions on Palestinian refugees, not a predominant number, but still dealt with by the United Nations Security Council. Of course, during that same period, there was not one resolution specifically on Jewish refugees from Arab countries. The General Assembly was worse. Comprising all 192 members of the United Nations, the General Assembly provides a multilateral discussion of any and all international issues. From 1949 to 2014, General Assembly resolutions focused much greater attention on the issue of Palestinian refugees, 188, some 20% of all of its resolutions, more than any other Middle East issue, including Jerusalem, including occupied territories, including settlements, including borders. Palestinian refugees, 20% of all UN resolutions since 1947. There was never any General Assembly resolution that specifically addressed the issue of Jewish refugees, nor any resolutions on other topics that even mentioned Jewish refugees from Arab countries. In total, there have been 1,187 General Assembly and Security Council resolutions dealing with every aspect of the Middle East and the Arab-Israeli conflict. Among those numbers, there were a total of 188 resolutions on Palestinian refugees. The fact that there was not one recorded UN resolution on Jewish refugees was not from a lack of trying. From 1947 and well into the 1970s, on numerous occasions, governmental and non-governmental officials, Israeli, US, and others, alerted the United Nations to the plight of Jewish refugees and sought UN intervention to no avail. The UN pattern of exclusivity, focusing only on Palestinian refugees, continues today, as every single year, 4 virtually verbatim resolutions in support of Palestinian refugees are adopted by the United Nations. Such is the case of what UN resolutions. With respect to UN agencies, there are at least 10 identifiable UN agencies that have been specifically created or charged with addressing issues affecting Palestinian refugees. There were never any UN entities created to address issues affecting Jewish refugees from Arab countries. Only the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, by mandate, and in a very superficial and peripheral way, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees provided no protection, you recall, protection, resettlement, rehabilitation. The UNHCR provided no protection whatsoever for Jewish refugees. The UNHCR provided no resettlement whatsoever for Jewish refugees. The only service they did provide was rehabilitation. They tried to assist in the recovery of Jewish assets in Arab countries, and I must state that they failed miserably at this task. With respect to the third criteria, financial resources. From 1950 to 2012, the United Nations, through UNRWA, contributed $17.7 billion to maintain and sustain Palestinian refugees in their geographically mandated areas in the West Bank, Gaza, Jordan, Syria, and Lebanon. By contrast, during that same period, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees provided no comparable financial assistance for Jewish refugees. I cannot say no assistance whatsoever, because we did discover one allocation from the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees to Jewish refugees. In 1947, a grant of $30,000 was provided from the fund of the UN High Commissioner to help Jews leaving Egypt. This funding was provided subject to 2 provisos. Number 1, that there would be absolutely no publicity about this. They did not want the world to know that the United Nations was helping Jewish refugees. And number 2, that grant was converted into a loan, and which was subsequently paid back by the international joint on behalf of Jewish refugees from Arab countries. No financial assistance from the international community towards the plight of Jewish refugees from Arab countries. So there was no symmetry between the manner in which the international community addressed these 2 refugee populations. There is, however, one important factor that applies to both, namely the moral and legal imperative to ensure that the rights of all bona fide refugees are fully acknowledged, respected, and addressed within any putative resolution on the Middle East conflict. Hence, the need to ameliorate double discrimination. The first injustice, the first discrimination, was the mass violations of the human rights of Jews in Arab countries. The second injustice, the second discrimination, was the absence of any credible UN response to the plight of Jews from Arab countries. Today, it would constitute a third injustice were we to allow any continuing UN recognition of the rights of one refugee population, Palestinians, without recognizing the legitimate rights of that second population of victims, Jews from Arab countries. In closing, I wish to state that recognizing rights of Jews from Arab countries is a call for truth, justice, and reconciliation. It is time for courageous leadership to recognize these truths, that justice for Jews from Arab countries must assume its rightful place on the international political agenda, that any narrative on the Middle East that does not include justice for Jewish refugees is a case study in Middle East revisionism. And 3, that rights for Jewish refugees from Arab countries must be part of any narrative, any peace process, if that narrative or peace process is going to have any integrity, credibility, and legitimacy. In the words of the Honorable Urman, former Justice Minister of Canada and Honorary Chairman of Justice for Jews from Arab countries, where there is no truth, there will be no justice. Where there will be no justice, there will be no reconciliation. And where there is no reconciliation, there will be no durable peace between and among all peoples in the region. Thank you very much.